All right. I think we are live. What is going on? I'm Balance Panther, and this is some of the finals gameplay. With that being said, I think we're gonna straight hop into quick cash. I don't think we're gonna waste any time doing anything. I'm on stream, so we're just gonna vibe for the next 2 hours, kind of. Let me pop my Twitch menu open. Get started. Not summary. I want to go to the dashboard. All right. Pull things up on my phone. Make sure audio sounds good. We're not too loud, not too quiet. That is YouTube, not Twitch. Mute myself quickly. All right, let me make one small change to my desktop audio because the game audio is so loud. Oh, and that is why I straight just have the game turned up. Limiter, noise gate. I think that should be it at least. What do I have that set up for? My mic. That will get some idea. Filters, limiter. I have my threshold at 1.9. So if I come back over here to my desktop audio, filters. Maybe I will keep that a little bit lower. Keep it at 5 decibels. We'll see what that sounds like. And then the noise gate. I keep going to properties. Negative 32, 26. Okay, so that was our default. Okay, that should hopefully sound better. Let me go ahead, pull stream back up, see what game audio sounds like then. I think that should mean we should have game sound as well. We I think we are good. I think the audio sounds right now. I don't know if it's gonna sound like in game, so I'm gonna do one more check. But as far as I can tell, things sound better than they have in the past. So that's a good thing. But how's it going, guys? Is anyone in chat yet? No, it does not seem like that is so. That's fine. I am just not getting started in. It's 10 a.m. in the morning, so. Good morning. All right. Update the stream name. So we are chilling. All right. We're gonna hop in to some quick cash. Let's check out these new skins. I really like this. I saw this I want to say it was in a YouTube video or something over the week. Let's look at all the new things. The spud cannon for the noob tube, the rocket, or not the rocket launcher, the grenade launcher. Got a nice skin, nice charms. Do not try this at home. I like that. Got the cardboard set for the minigun. Of course, the helmet. New dance. How we sound? That's my mic coming through on stream. But sorry, guys. It's like, why is it reverberating? I am the problem.
Here we go. The retros, the steamrollers, and finally, the powerhouses. The finish line is
I will point that this is my first match of the day. I woke up at like 9:30 and rolled out of bed, and we are live with it, so please forgive my gameplay.
Vault 1 is being opened by the retros.
Jesus. The audio in my headphones is so loud. I swear I just turned it down too, is the crazy part.
Introduce themselves as we've got our first elimination of the match.
And not even a polite hello.
Trading a passive.
Bringing you back.
Actions speak louder than words.
Yo, get on him.
Go! Move the cash out, B!
Take charge
Just a
attitude to the
tad
retros.
bit.
First cash out started.
I'm just destroying everybody, apparently.
The Steamrollers have returned to the arena.
Defibrillating. Wall hack. Obstacle back in place. This will burn.
One of our contestants is having fun with our destructible environment today.
Removing obstacle.
He came around swinging.
Contestant is on a roll. Elimination to
The Retros
Squeaky witch. Back to the battle.
On him. Oh my god, I'm popping off this match.
flattened once more. Bad luck.
I did not need that apology, apparently. Oh. Yeah. What? I had to have been a second off of that. Oh.
school move still.
Ooh. Get him. Yeah.
The Retros are respawning and hoping to recreate.
He was on that man's butt.
Retaliation is coming. The
Pause.
Steamrollers need to stay on track.
I'm back.
The Retros are busy unwrapping Vault 2.
Gotta reload. Jump zone here. Wall hack.
Powerhouses swooped up the
Obstacle
cash
back in
box.
place. Removing obstacle.
Prepare for a tumultuous turn of fortune as we've raised the damage levels in the arena to new extremes.
Tossing some fire.
The Powerhouses are initiating a cash out.
I realized I could probably just shot the barrel, but it was too late at that point.
Pyro grenade out.
The Steamrollers come to a halt again. Another team wipe.
We gonna win this. This one gonna be easy.
Obstacle removed.
A contestant is really cutting through the competition.
Throwing pyro grenade.
The Retros are back and ready to avenge that team wipe.
Retaliation. No, the powerhouses need to stay alert.
Dematerialize. Obstacle
Contestant
removed.
is collecting eliminations one after another.
Unhacking.
And that's the end of the mega damage event.
This will burn.
powerhouses keep the momentum going.
Storm Vault 3!
And there's another vault available for our cash.
Defense successful! Hacking obstacle! Environment hack! I'm back! Enemy over there!
I should have known better.
Busy unwrapping vault 3.
He was standing on a head glitch, waiting for it.
This might burn!
I'm on 6 revives and 8 kills. I am mobbing through the session. Like, why did he stick that?
The steamrollers.
Emote on him, please. Because the sweep would have been so nice right there.
Cash out set in motion by the steamrollers. A contestant is dishing out some destruction. Good riddance.
Ooh, where?
It's back to the past again for the Retros with another wipe on the board.
Dematerialize!
They've been archived, Scotty.
Because where is this guy at? Because I didn't kill him. But unless they got him. I just didn't
The
see it.
Retros are re-entering the arena.
They've had time to plot their comeback. The powerhouses better watch out.
Hop on up! Environment hack! Rematerialize!
Impressed with the team.
Yo, get out of here. This pink team is so disrespectful, bruh. It's like y'all aren't pushing objective, but we'll pull up the fight. Whole pink team on objective is crazy. This is going to be an interesting battle
Get out
for the
of hand if
dubs.
they use the
The fuck out of here, boy.
Bounce!
Neck and neck with an equal cash score for all teams.
Get him out of here.
A vault just spawned. Let's see who takes a crack at it first.
He's giving bro to run around. I think, at least. Damn.
Using pyro grenade!
Lift up a cash box.
Go to cash out station!
Stacked by the powerhouses. Let's see if they take you to the
Damn.
cash out station.
I did not know where he was. I thought the boss was coming from behind me through the door. I was about to say, get him.
I'm gonna use that zip line. Charge to cash out D. Creating a path!
Holy my aimer. Get my boy back up.
Go for a steal on D.
Cause why are y'all still over here? Weirdos.
Dematerializing. Enemy down there. Removing obstacle. Removing
A setback for the
I was
powerhouse.
not playing by that objective.
obstacle. Steal cash out D.
The powerhouse has just responded full strength.
Jump pad here.
Every second counts.
Screening a passage. Dematerialize.
By the powerhouses.
There's no way. Where are my
30
teammates?
seconds remaining.
Concentration
Get it
is
off,
key
come
in
on.
these final moments.
I could have swore I was shot from another direction than I was.
Environment hack. Screening a passage.
Fuck. No, I was too. I was being so dirty. Just short elbow's brain for a left hook.
Certainly cranked out a win in this.
Oh, it doesn't matter whether we drop 40 kills. Doesn't matter. If they just won the objective. Hey, that was a fire first game though. That was a fire first game. Connect to the next server while I won. I
Right. The steamrollers.
think I finished the Pyro Grenade Challenge. That kind of works out.
The ultra rares. The pressure is
Headshot
on.
at
Time to bring their
opponents,
best.
play 3 matches, first win, get a puff with the cash box. Then we'll try the cash box this game.
Today, contestants will navigate a maze of
Because
digital
I don't gotta do it
marvels
one
and
more
glitches
time,
as
so
they
I
compete for fame
don't know why I
and
haven't.
Obstacle removed.
Vault 1 is being unlocked by the ultra rares.
We've got our first eliminator.
Dematerialize.
Now the mind games and strategic plays will really start to take center stage.
It's sink or swim time.
Who will rise to the occasion?
The Bounty's got hold of the cash box.
Hacking obstacle. Teammates back.
Devastating first team.
Holy.
A contestant has hit a streak, eliminating opponents one by one.
Impressive steal by the Ultra Rares.
Frag grenade out.
Now that's how you play to win this game show.
Obstacle removed. Enemy spotted. Wall hack. Set delivery. Dematerializing. Removing obstacle. Jump. Throwing a frag. Removing obstacle.
Oh no, I want to go down the stairs, not up.
The Ultra Rares suffered a wipeout.
Okay, let's reset. Oh, we lost this.
Soon, are we starting
We held it for too long.
I'm feeling it. Impressive steal by the Boundless.
Ah, that was so well played.
What a way to open the match. The Boundless land the first cash out.
And they stole that with confidence
Hate
earlier.
the glass. You run up to it and you think it's invisible until it's
Reading a
not.
passage.
The Boundless are re-entering the arena.
Who's ready to roll? Looks like the Steamrollers could be in for a bumpy ride.
The Ultra Rares swooped up again.
Dematerialize.
Relocating.
Cash out C. Let's go.
I'm about to say he had to have just ran. I heard. But I heard him pick it up.
Just keep coming for the Boundless.
They're in a bind now, Scotty.
Dematerializing.
Things about to get downright devastating in the arena. As any damage is about to be magnified and
Hit me
intensified.
with that shack.
The Ultra
I ain't
Rares
see it
is
coming.
in motion.
How is this guy dropped 11 kills already? I gotta play World Tour apparently.
Took him out. Fire grenade out.
I guess that cash out isn't going anywhere. Nice anti-theft.
I'm happy my teammates are doing what they got to do.
Creating a passage.
Contestants
Doctor's
trying
here.
stringing together one elimination
Obstacle back
after
in
another.
place. Time to bound. Dematerialize.
Quick reflexes after that attempted cash out heist. Nice reception.
And that's a
Okay, let's go. Okay, I thought I was getting melted. I didn't realize we were gonna make a damage. Holy.
Well done by the ultra rares.
The ultra rares rarely leave each
I
other's
was not
sight.
taking advantage of the ultra damage or whatever.
The ultra rares
Just
will
'cause I
have to polish
did
their
not realize it
strategy from the
started.
sidelines.
So much happening. I pressed the button.
The ultra rares burst into action, opening Vault 3. The ultra
Dash to
rares
cash
swooped
out
up
D.
the cash box.
Let's get airborne.
A cash box has a new carrier. The Boundless now have control of it.
Environment hack. Frag grenade out.
Nice play by the Boundless, kicking off the cash out.
Oh my god.
Eliminations are piling up for a contestant out there. Let's see how far they can take it.
Back in action. Wall hack. Obstacle removed.
Where are you? Why did you run away?
Taking damage. I'm reloading.
Like, how do you have a healing demon? I don't even know him. Like, we are so far into the game.
Steamrollers as they suffer a new team wipe. Set the stage. Now let's see the second unfold.
You can feel the momentum shifting with every place though.
The Boundless push boundaries and stole a cash out.
He ran straight headshots on that dude and still didn't catch the fade.
Wall hack. Environment hack.
Can you believe it? Equal footing for all our
Grenade out.
teams. This is where legends are made. Another vault has surfaced. Let the
No
chaos
flatlights on
unfold.
my watch.
I don't feel like I'm doing nothing crazy. I just keep rotating hard left every time I get a kill or two, or you know, get some damage off. And it keeps working in these lobbies.
The Steamrollers have turned up the heat and rolled back into the fight. The Boundless are forcing open Vault 4.
Ah!
Removing obstacles.
Okay.
The Boundless picked up a cash box.
Removing obstacles.
Endless possibilities ahead as the Boundless have started a
Steal
cash
cash out A.
Get him out of here.
Creating a passage. Dematerialize. Dematerializing. Frag grenade set.
Impressive steal by the Steamrollers.
Wow, that was a
Creating a
bold
passage. Okay, let's go.
Only a minute left for our contestants to show the world what they're made of.
It's all about heart and determination.
Obstacle removed.
The Boundless can't seem to catch their stride. They're down again.
Looks like they've just hit the ceiling.
The Boundless are back and ready to avenge that team wipe. Cash out confiscated by the Ultra Rares.
Aggressive and impressive.
We're in the final 30 seconds. It's all or nothing now.
Let's see who can rise to the occasion.
Dematerialize. Tossing a frag.
Ten seconds.
Snap back to life.
A sizzling
go.
victory for the Ultra Rares in that match. Well
Big
done.
dub, big
And with that,
We'll
dub.
see you next time at the finals.
Bum, 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 bum. Do, 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 do. Nope. Look like we're playing some heavy today. Just for the dailies. Oh, and then release stage 3. Let's go. Let's just go and track all of these. Headshots. Oh, that's neat. Yup. We still got like, how many days does it say? 40 until the battle pass ends? Hey, we're kind of chilling because I'm already at tier like 70. Last season, I was literally doing last minute challenges to get the mask. I need to remember, I need to change my F-car skin.
Now, the high notes, the overdogs, and finally, the mighty. The stakes are higher than ever. Let's go. In Quick Cash, it's all about the rush for riches. The team that gathers enough cash first will seal the win.
Right you are, Scotty. Time to turn up the heat in this thrilling cash quest.
One contestant doesn't seem to like rigid
Backing up.
structures. Much will stand when they're done. The overdogs are standing proudly on their high walking vault wall.
Here we
Throwing
go,
a frag.
Scotty. The teams are getting to know each other out there. And by that I mean we have our first
Environment hack.
elimination.
Boy, oh boy, are we in for a treat today. cash box.
Tossing a frag!
That cash box was up for
Jump
grabs
pad
for
ready.
mere seconds, and the overdogs fetched it.
Cash out B, let's move!
Masai. Saw or heard somebody else
The
come in.
overdogs have made the opening move. First cash out underway.
Oh, come on. I tried to throw it. I don't know what it picked up or what happened there, but. Yes, sir.
Took a hit. Double here. We've seen our first team wipe, and it's not pretty.
Impressive steal by the mighty.
But will there be consequences, Scotty?
Special delivery!
Get his ass out of here.
Deploying jump pad! Wall hack! I got you! Restoring obstacle! Dematerializing!
Cash out by a contestant. That's how you play. The high notes are re-entering the arena.
Jesus Christ. I don't know where those guys came from, but.
First cash out.
Oh, he's playing on corners and stuff. I forgot you could do that with the spear.
Scotty,
Because they hit through barricades, all that.
right.
But good shit on that first objective. Let's see. We're gonna head to C next.
Target vault 2! Let's get airborne! Removing obstacle!
Pushing into vault.
Removing
The mighty.
obstacle! Unhacking!
The high notes are back on the scene.
Let's hope they don't get caught in a dangerous spot again.
Creating a passage!
The mighty got
Move
the
to cash
box.
out C! Deploying jump pad! Quick, to cash out C! Dematerializing!
Strong moves from the mighty as they set things in motion. team wipe for the Overdogs. They're off their game today. The Overdogs have returned to the arena.
Retaliation is on the cards. The mighty will need eyes in the back of their heads.
Dematerializing! Frag out! Creating a passage!
Oh, come on. Now, this guy's a better heavy than I am. He's hitting everything around the corners. He's making sure he's always in cover. Like, this guy is crazy, even if he's using the speed.
Another team wipe.
I need to train this guy. Because I've not seen bad gameplay from him yet, at least. Like, he's out here doing solid works.
Obstacle removed! Dematerializing! Throwing a frag!
Whistle and flute with money to boot. It's a cash out for the high
Access
notes.
vault 3!
Very impressive. They turned a steal into a cash out.
There's a fresh vault up for grabs. The tension is rising.
Told you stop targeting me already.
The Overdogs are standing proudly on their hind
It's just gonna keep getting toxic from here, bro. Because I'll take it there. I have no problem doing so. I was about to say, how you couldn't get me? They just sniped me.
Shields up!
The Overdogs swooped up a cash box.
Yup. Got
The
him.
midpoint is here, and the stakes are climbing higher.
The stakes couldn't be higher.
Back in action!
He got mad, so he started standing on the crane.
Reloading!
The Overdogs are going for it. Cash out initiated.
Ooh wee.
Let's get airborne! Special delivery!
Oh shit. This pink team moving crazy. Like, they're moving straight wicked on me. I don't think I killed one of them in quite some time. Yeah, believe him.
Jump pad deployed!
It took this man forever to finally get that kill off. This is risky. I was like, he did not have to do this.
Another tumble for the mighty. Team wiped. The mighty are back in action.
But this kind of sets us up in a good spot. That might have worked out. We could win this here. But we also kind of have to defend orange from taking it.
Hacking obstacle! Environment hack!
This game is
Why is everybody on me? I'm being targeted. No, I mean, I guess I am literally emoting on people's bodies. I'm running this one straight to A, it seems. Just to switch it up, because they're going to expect it to go far yet again, especially if we get here first. So if we get here first, I'm straight pushing A. We're doing it hot this time.
Deploying jump pad.
The overdogs are rising to the challenge. They're opening for four.
Man, why is this dude always where I'm at?
A contestant is moving from elimination to elimination. Gotta reload.
The high notes got the cash box.
Okay, let's go. Ball hack.
Clever play by the mighty.
Vote for
A
cash out
box
A,
is
now.
now under their command.
Ooh, it smells like breakfast. My mom's cooking.
Be careful.
Mighty are keeping it strong.
Obstacle removed. Rematerializing.
Why are you fighting me? Fuck out that finger W. Can't stand this guy, bro.
Slightly less than a mighty performance from the mighty. They're down again.
I don't know how many times I gotta press W, but
Hop on up.
apparently it's more than once.
Impressive steal.
Ball hack.
Was unexpected.
Environment hack. Frag grenade out.
The overdogs just made their return to the arena.
After that earlier altercation, the high notes should probably stay on high alert.
Our contestants need to hurry up. 1 minute left.
The teams need to push hard to secure their victory.
A strong offensive push by the mighty as they steal a cash out.
Removing obstacle. Tossing frag. Snap back fire.
30 seconds to go.
Josie, you're not feeling the pressure more than our contestants. Enemy down.
10 seconds left. The mighty muscled their way to the top in the match. And with that, we'll see you next time at the finals.
Some of these matches, boy. They're good matches, they're just rough.
Alrighty, the Jet Setters. And
All right.
finally, the Tough Shells. They've
Back
worked hard to get here. Now it gets real.
I need to switch to heavy this match.
Welcome to Quick
So I can get that
Cash.
challenge out the way with the
Contestants
shack
need to
and
gather
the,
cash faster than the rest. If they hit the goal
give me
first,
5,000
they
damage or
can
something.
bask in glory.
That's right, Scotty. This is going to be a nail biter.
The mighty are ready to peel into Vault 1.
Removing obstacle.
Contestant down, and with that we have our first elimination of the match.
Creating a
I
passage.
hope the viewers at home
Obstacle
are ready for a
restored.
wild ride.
This ride's only going to get faster from here.
Dematerialize.
The Jet Setters swooped up the cash box.
Frag out.
Come on, press the fucking button. Jesus Christ.
Time to bounce.
The Jet Setters waste.
Oh my god. Oh, thank you.
Jump zone here.
Now leave me alone. Woo.
Frag grenade set. Special delivery.
Got me a breakfast bowl.
Pyro grenade.
Holocaust sausage and eggs. All in a bowl. Did you get the cow push? That's wild. Okay. I was a little distracted there. Oh.
I'm back. Frag out. Using gas grenade. Tossing some fire.
Well, that's the moose. No, not I've been able to respond for a while.
Jump zone here.
What a way to open the match. The Jet Setters land the first cash out.
Light in the fast lane. First team wiping the bag, and it's a highlight.
Let's see
Open
what
vault
the
two.
Jet
fuck.
Setters are re-engaging.
Retaliation is about to hit hard. The Tough Shells need to get fortified.
The Tough Shells break through, opening Vault 2.
Grateful!
Cash box.
Thank you!
Dematerializing.
I didn't even have to fight that. I don't know why I shot.
It's time for them to move those virtual feet or face the consequences thanks to a laser hammer.
The Tough Shells have returned to the arena.
I bet they feel unstoppable. If I were the mighty, I'd watch my back.
Time to bounce.
The Jet Setters will need to try again. Team wiped.
They stalled for sure.
Gonna jump.
Our orbital laser's vent is still active. objective, so our contestants need to keep moving to avoid going out like a light. The mighty have commenced a cash out.
Defibrillating!
Dude, you are so lame.
Grenade out! Creating a passage!
Nigga so thirsty for kills. Whoa!
Jump pad deployed!
So far from objective.
We've got the jet setters returning to the
Going
arena.
for the revive. Reloading. Fire a grenade out. We're at the end of this game show event. What a spectacle!
I'm going for that zip line!
Who the fuck did that?
Tough break for our tough shells as they suffer another team wipe.
They tried to climb up the competition, but ended up getting shucked.
The tough shells are coming back out of their shells. Team respawn.
Let's hope they can avoid any awkward moments this time.
The mighty completed a cash out.
Jump pad
Secure all
here!
three.
Obstacle removed! Dematerialized!
Vault 3 is being pierced by the tough shells. The jet setters swooped up a cash box. Tough
Idiot.
shells cracked once more, folks. Team wipe.
The kid was so desperate. That's what I'm saying. Like, this map is so, or like these people are so
Return
weird.
to the arena.
And my teammates won't adjust for it apparently,
The mighty
because
event a brace for impact.
they're just getting swamped on.
They're showing their skill. Big play launched by the mighty.
Frag grenade sent. Special delivery.
Impressive steal by the jet setters.
Poison en route.
As we cross the midway mark, there's no telling how this will play out.
I can feel the energy in the air, Scotty. This is going to be unforgettable.
Jump pad ready! Setting a crack!
This is why my teammates are
Toxic gas set.
losing so many fights. He's not aiming them either. Okay. Noted. I don't feel that bad for losing this game now. Bro's using the bike.
The mighty
He refuses the ABS.
match powering their way
There's nothing
to
I can do about
victory.
that. I
On
can't
behalf
fix
of
my
all of us
teammate.
here at the finals. Thanks for watching.
Come on. Hop over here. Try some. Mr. Moose. The big old Doug. Look at my puppy. Look at the big baby. I'm gonna pause and eat real quick. Hey, hey, hey. What up, what up? Welcome to the stream. Whoever just hopped in here. I'm currently taking a small break to eat, but while I do so, I am here chatting, so feel free to say what's up in the chat. Let me pull up my music. Where do I have it coming from? It says I have Chrome tabs open. Did I open it through Spotify again? Oh, I did. Let's see. I'm missing these songs. Not really. Not based off the name of them, at least. Alright. Alright, I am almost done. I'm also gotta switch over to heavy. I got some challenges I need to start doing. All right. Put everything back in the bowl. Take this sip of water. And we'll get back to the entertainment. The big old boots. The big old Ugg boots. I don't know why they got the slit down the middle, but what else? All right. Get this match started. Wait. Oh, you trying to hop in here, Bungle? Is this you in chat? My bad, bro. I would definitely invite you between the next rounds.
All right. The Tough Shells, the Retros, and finally, the Steamrollers. It's now or never. Let the battle begin.
Yo.
I'd be in stream if I could remember my fucking Twitch login.
Yo. You technically are in stream. They can hear you and you're on overlay.
I know, but like I'd be in like watching the stream if I could
Yeah.
remember my Twitch login.
Oh,
I have
is this
no
not
idea.
you logged in or like watching?
That's our first elimination.
I mean, I was in there. I tried to say something and then it's like, you need an account, retard.
Couldn't agree
Yeah.
more, Scotty.
Twitch is very strict about you having your information.
Well, no, yeah. If you're gonna chat, you have to have like a username. Like,
Yeah.
but I also haven't used my Twitch account in like 3 years, and so I think they've just like disabled it.
Go to do a password reset. See if this is the verification. That's what I had to do. I'm saying I hadn't used this account in years.
Holy shit, my computer had it just saved. It was breaking.
That's wild.
Wait, it sent. Oh my god, it sent the confirmation code in my old
The
phone.
Steamrollers
Password
take charge.
managers,
First
BUI.
cash-out triggered.
They started shooting me in the back.
Planting a mine. Mind the mine.
It started auto playing some random Twitch.
Yeah,
I think.
it's like the main menu always has some like big stream going on.
Whatever, dog.
I usually mute all of the streams whenever I leave, just so that whenever I start back up, I don't do that to me.
I'm now watching your stream. Oh my gosh, having Moose in the background is so perfect.
Moose is right here.
The dog.
He loves to lay here whenever I'm streaming. It's hilarious because it's not like I make him lay there.
The delay is actually only like 3 seconds. It's
No,
really
it's
not
not
that big.
bad. It's almost unnoticeable.
I expected it to be way worse.
I
Oh,
want to add more, honestly,
Save the boat, Scotty.
just so that I don't get sniped.
Just made their
But also, it's not been a problem yet, so
From that hard exit
No.
and ready to rock. The tough shells need to look out.
Tough Shells land the first cash out.
It seems that they're almost
you just didn't have to fight them at all, guy. Like that was an option.
Let's go for Vault 2.
Yeah, that guy was kind of vibing on his own accord.
Sure thing.
The Retros are eyeing the contents of Vault 2.
Enemy spot. Get down there.
Well, there was one on me, and 2 of his teammates were tagged. So it's up to my team at this point.
Which that's a really good
Get the big ass.
for them to get.
Apparently, I'm not the only one in this lobby not having fun. Someone just left. Behind
Moving.
you.
Follow me.
I just want to get kills with the shack.
Reloading. One less enemy. Taking damage.
Shucks, another raw deal to the tough shells. They'll be back though.
I wish I had my jump pad now. I could fly across the map.
The tough shells are re-entering the arena. The tough shells picked up a cash box.
Deploying a surprise.
A contestant is on an elimination streak.
Two things is I think you should adjust the like overlay for your camera to be like the same aspect ratio as your
That's probably what I need to do.
Camera? And maybe I think consider moving it to the right side. I don't know
I'll put it a
if
little
you
higher than my head.
yeah maybe
But not
just have
higher
it
than my
locked to
head,
the
but
Discord overlay instead
that's the
of
tell.
yeah.
When
Or
I
have it
first
on the
set
right
that up, I was not in game. Actually, I can fix that right now.
Mind the mine. Gas mine set.
It's not hard to do.
Move such a good doggy.
It is actually a lot harder than I thought because I have to be not paused.
Down for the steamrollers. They're down again.
They were on the wrong side of that thing.
Just bring it up.
Respawned and revving their
There,
engines.
like there,
The
yeah.
steamrollers are back in the
Yes.
arena.
The vibe is shifting. The retros could be in for some serious.
And then is there a way for you to shrink that? Like bring it in OBS? Is that like an overlay thing?
It's an aspect ratio thing. It's the file type. I gotta change it entirely. I thought that's one off the internet, just
Okay,
literally temporarily.
So you just need like a 4:3
Yeah,
aspect ratio thing instead of a 16:9.
I can change my camera. The camera and the overlay are 2 different pieces.
I think the aspect ratio is fine. I kind of like the 4:3 because it's like, you know, it's in the
Wow.
corner. The game's the main focus. You're just there and you can see everything you need to see.
I was trying to take up too much space over it, honestly. I want it to be inside those blue lines. And when I make it bigger, it makes the, it's like, it tries to keep it,
You can't stop the
like,
steamrollers.
the same, if that makes sense. But if I adjust at one corner, it adjusts all the corners.
Oh yeah.
So
Yep,
I can't
yep,
make it
yep.
wider, I can only make it bigger.
You can't change the aspect ratio.
Yeah.
The stakes
Yeah.
just jumped with a new vault.
You need to. I mean, I think the size. Yeah, the size of you is perfect. It's just the size of the border needs to be adjusted to match the size of you. And now it won't snap into place. That's hilarious.
Yeah. But that's just how it is. I mean,
The steamrollers are unrolling Vault 3.
I think that's a little, it's a little better. Whatever. It works for now. At least until I actually
Just get
fix
yeah.
things.
You just could just get a new
Charge
border.
to cash out C.
Michael could literally draw you something up.
Cash box in our hands.
That was my ultimate plan. I just haven't got around to asking. I figured it'd be easier for me to understand OBS, how to set the stream up on my end, and then get him to onboard all my stuff.
The Retros
Yeah.
respawn.
I mean, I'm sure
That's
a
what I'm
little
planning
like
to do.
graphical border would be like he would just do. He'd like shit that out like in the middle of lunch.
Nah, for real.
As we pass the halfway point of the match, you
Sprint
can
to
cut
cash
the
out
tension
C.
with a knife. Or an
I've seen him push out whole projects in like 2 or 3 hours. Like that what
Yeah.
Dave do.
With
Yeah.
crushing force, the steamrollers have
So
started
I don't
When he locks in on Photoshop, he gets going.
on anything, like just period when Michael locks in.
You just it's the struggle is getting him to lock in.
Same,
The stakes have to be very high to get him to lock in. Uh-oh. That's not a good thing to turn around and see.
Just one good overhand's all it takes. And then somehow I grappled the freaking stage, not the cash
Yo.
box.
Vontae, if you get partnered, I'll be able to give you my Twitch Prime subscription.
Yeah. Drop a follow. It helps. I am
I did.
like a fifth of the way. Well, not fifth, a fourth of the
You got
way
8 followers.
to affiliate.
successfully guarded.
You're almost to 10. You got to 10! Bro that's watching just followed. Let's go.
Tough shells.
Oh, there's somebody here. Hey, what's up, guy?
Enthusiasm. The Retros will
I have the
Come on,
OBS stream
he's
up.
He's chatting. How you
Oh.
doing?
Let me not neglect, bro. Hold on,
His
guys.
headphones. He said his headphones broke, so he can't
Who is it? What's her
hear.
name? Sneaky Batty? Or is it somebody else? I'm tired.
Talk about having a trick up your
Okay, hold on. Let me
Nah,
blow things up. Oh, it's Jingle
Frozen
Goose
Pop.
or Santa Louis. So I can't hear your voice. It would be great to respond to chat instead.
That's
No,
not happening. But
I would say definitely not while I'm playing. At least.
we got 10 followers.
Heck yeah.
The Tough Shells displayed uncrackable strategy and armored speed
Hold on.
with this win. On behalf of all of us here at the finals, thanks for watching.
Oh my god.
I just want to thank all 10 of my followers. I didn't prepare a speech for today. However, this is a momentous occasion. So I really wanted to, from the bottom of my heart, say thank you.
Pet the dog. We just want the dog. We're not here for you. Pet the dog.
Moose Cam. Look at that big belly. Look at it. Look at that belly.
This is the moose. This is actually the moose stream.
Yeah. We're not even here for the finals anymore. This is just
Nope.
moose.
You need to make the stream thumbnail just a close up of moose somehow.
I think it updates every few seconds or every few minutes.
All right.
I don't know if you can make it one. Oh damn!
Don't queue. Stop queuing. Stop
I'm just
queuing.
gonna leave. I completely it just hit me.
Bro.
I
You
auto
Uber.
queue. As soon as the game's over, I just push play.
SMH.
There's not even like a second thought about it. Can I get another invite? Yo. Alright, let's run this shit. Oh, you bought the skin? Or did you just buy the mask?
I just got the mat.
That's sick.
I wanted the gray mat.
Level 70 on the battle pass already.
I'm 73.
Been playing a considerable amount this season. Oh, I didn't even realize there was skins past level 100. I didn't even
Yeah.
see this. Holy. Well, that outfit's sick at the end. That plus this mask.
I need the Ospu's wings.
I think I've hit my goal just about every time I've streamed at this point. I've been wanting to do one follower each stream. That's it. I don't think, maybe I haven't done it perfectly, but I think if you average out the amount of streams I've done.
Here we go. The Retros. The Kingfish. And finally, the Powerhouses. The challenge intensifies. Let's see who prevails.
Move to vault
And
1.
hello, it seems CNS has flipped our script to transform the arena into a hacker's paradise. Let the game begin.
A treat for our fans as the Powerhouses are opening Vault 1.
Oh, Jesus.
There's no turning back now.
He clicked on my head each bullet, bruh.
Yeah,
That's the final score.
exactly, and it's why we love this show. Anything can happen.
This pink guy sucks. It's the orange guy I gotta watch out for.
Frag out.
Bro, he's right on me. He's a cloak pussy. Oh, you're outmaneuvering him. Oh.
This guy sucks, dude.
Things are heating
I
up.
just didn't have HP.
Dudes that like constantly re-cloak in the middle of a fight is so cringe.
The
Retros
worst.
got the cash box.
Because you're not effectively doing anything. You're just being annoying.
That cash box was up for grabs for mere seconds, and the Kingfish grabbed it. The Powerhouses have respawned. Let's see how they bounce back.
Yo, that barrel had so much value from this distance.
A cash box is now with the Powerhouses, folks. Things sure change quickly around here.
You hit me with the
Gonna use that
180.
zip line.
First cash out launched by the
Defend on A.
Powerhouses.
Hit all of them with the 180. Orange behind you. That guy was coming for your ass. He had an RPG out.
Like
a fucking-
for a minute.
It was like a Mujahideen fighter. He was coming for that fucking. He was gonna shoot down your fucking Blackhawk.
My black hole.
Frag grenade out.
No, the cloak dude's on me. 1 HP.
One down. Moving obstacle. Rematerializing.
Gonna be okay.
Impressive steal by the
I'm
Retro.
gonna start seeing it.
I might not be though.
Sets the stakes higher,
Never
Scotty.
mind.
Careful, there's two revolvers. They're both using revolvers.
Down.
One of them's trash, one of them's good.
Powerhouses.
Yeah.
They'll want to recharge. The Powerhouses have respawned.
Things could get dicey if they cross paths with the Kingfish again.
Whoa. Shadouken.
We're in the safe zone.
How did that fall?
Barricade deployed. Setting a barricade.
Still got it.
Fantastic
Don't
steal
even
by the
worry.
Powerhouses.
Just extra style points.
What a way to open
Yeah.
the match. The Powerhouses
We're getting
land
it last
first cash
second.
out.
Fashionably
I would
late.
recommend getting in their way, Scotty.
I kind of cucked us throwing that barrel earlier. So I've heard grenades can like blow away the gas.
They blow away smoke.
Okay. I heard that if the smoke is on top of the gas, then it can also.
Then you,
blow
then
away.
no, if the smoke's on top of the gas, then it can't be dispersed by fire. The gas can't be dispersed by fire.
Okay,
But
I
a
heard
grenade
something
can
like
disperse
that.
the smoke.
And
There's
then
like a
it
little
can be
chess game that can
fire.
be played with the grenades.
Yeah. That's really cool. No other game has done that. Both revolvers on E.
Counter-Strike does that. With smokes and fires, Counter-Strike has.
I've
Except
actually
the
never noticed
smoke,
that.
the smoke puts out the fire
Is becoming a bit of a fixer-upper for
in
them.
Counter-Strike.
What?
The powerhouse
Yeah,
is
if you throw a
back.
smoke on top of a fire, it'll snuff out the fire.
The Kingfish
That's
better be prepared.
interesting. Oh, someone unfollowed. Who's that Santa Louis guy? I guarantee you.
Rose said never. Rose said never mind.
Oh my god, I hate blue canisters.
Frag out!
Bro, the two revolver kids. One's lit. I don't know if this is the move.
I don't think he's on me, bro.
The Kingfish swims straight to the action.
Got him.
Out in progress. Far from obsolete, the Retros steal a cash out.
Remember, that's illegal in many jurisdictions, but not here.
And the Kingfish just got hit by another word. Misfortune loves a target. The Kingfish have returned to the arena.
They
I put
certainly
down,
look
like,
determined.
Sleepy
The
Joe.
powerhouses could be there
You just
next
ran right
target.
past that guy too.
I didn't even see, bro.
I was
Mind
shooting
you.
at him. Behind me.
Not sorry, wrong person. I was looking at a teammate.
He isn't in chat, by the way.
There's so many people just playing the edge of the map. It's very hard for me to.
Oh my god, all of pink is here, bro.
Literally, this is what I'm saying. Like, everyone's playing the outskirts of the map. So I literally don't know where to do. Like, where to be. That's heavy.
And our other teammate's using the model, bro. Only one of us can do it.
Yeah.
He's copying my kit. What a gay man. I have the way cooler skins, you dumb idiot.
Deja vu for the Kingfish as they suffer a new team wipe.
They just couldn't swim away from that one.
Orange is dead. Just take it. Yeah, yeah, we win these. We win these all day.
Placing a cover.
He's dancing.
The powerhouse has turned up the amps to register an electrifying win. Thanks again to our sponsors
Easy win,
and
easy
to our
win.
viewers
Golf
at
clap.
home.
Easy one. Kinda stressful, but somehow
Yeah,
we
listen.
did it.
The most stressful games are the ones you win.
We stole it in the end.
Hey yo. Tier 70. Thermal bore tracking dart.
That was the first cash out game I've played in a while. I've been playing a lot of Power Shift.
Really?
It's so much fun.
It is fun. It just feels like TDM to me though.
No, I mean, kind of, but also everyone gets centralized in one location, and also it just like makes buildings collapse.
Yeah, literally. Like stuff.
I like how like you can be you're waiting in a building for the objective to come through, and then all of a sudden it just like falls out from under you because the objective is just going through the building.
Literally. No, that makes sense. I get the appeal. It is not my appeal.
I like the dynamic because there's always like a couple snipers like trying to, you know, just snipe on the things, so you can flank them, take them out, and then you can just go in
Push
and
the
kill everyone on the
objective.
platform.
Yeah. I said I was gonna stream till noon. I'm looking at a vibe. No one's really been here, but also I don't care. I'm literally just doing this for vibes.
My mom's cooking bacon and it smells really good, so I'm probably gonna get off at like 12 and eat
Mom brought mine in for me because I told her.
base.
I don't know. The grenade in the game feels really good, like the just standard grenade. RPG feels better. I don't know how that makes sense.
And finally, the ultra rares. The tension is at its peak. Brace yourselves.
It probably is.
Prepare for a
I think it does
whirlwind
less
fast dash.
damage.
The grenade's good now because no one uses it anymore.
Yeah.
Right on the money.
When there were two of them, everyone was always looking for a grenade.
Hello.
The RPG, it doesn't do it. I don't know. I feel like if they buff it, it does too much damage. If they nerf it, it's not gonna do anything.
By the Kingfish.
Rocket delivery.
I feel like maybe they could make it have a less of a cooldown, maybe.
That's my thought. But then you do so much damage, and then you add charge and slam on top of it.
The FAMAS does so much damage.
I really like it does.
Get ready for some heart-pounding action.
You won't want to miss a beat.
The Kingfish
Back in place.
Mangle,
I'm going to
stand
revive.
up.
Hold on.
Save me.
Getting you back.
I got God. I dematerialized through the ceiling and they shot me after I dropped down.
Damn.
Somehow.
As you were falling.
Light on me, he's lit. One shot on me. Bro,
One
there's
shot.
no way.
Where
Oh my God.
is this kid
Can't-
going?
You can't hit the one shot.
He's dead.
Thank you.
The Kingfish make an early splash. First cash out started.
There's still one alive. Be careful.
Catch up, B.
Our teammate made him seem like he got. I won't lie.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I really thought he died.
Still on B. Going in.
There's no way. Stop.
The first team wipe is in, and the arena is buzzing.
Bro, this fucking turret. Why would you do that?
Here's some cover. Here's some.
I was taking it.
I was up there into the open.
Ultra rares.
One skilled play can change the game.
And it didn't pull till you after you started taking. I had thrown it before then.
Oh my god. Where did that flamethrower guy come from?
He jumped in the window. He saw you jump in, so he jumped through the window after you.
Kill him. Yes. Grab me through the window. Yeah. Wait, cover point, cover point.
Another
We
missile.
got it. Hold on. We got it. We got it. We got it. We got it.
Team wipe.
Barricading.
Open the match. The ultra rares land the first cash out.
They got me, but I'm very much dead.
I skedaddled away. How did he know where I was? They just like knew where I was.
I think he knew you were coming back for the res.
Unlocking Vault 2.
And just
No,
happened to
it's
run
because
into
the
you.
objective went the same way I did.
The ultra rares
So they were
are
just running to
re-engaging.
objective, and I happened to be that same direction.
We've cranked up the damage in the arena. Side effects include crumbling buildings and
The Kingfish grab the catapults.
Bro,
a contestant is on a roll, people.
why did our teammate just rush then?
Elimination to the next.
The ultra rares find themselves caught in this round. Wiped again.
I'm sure they're hoping those wipes will be few and far between.
June, you're bringing the A game today. Our mega damage event is still active, and there's already enough digital debris in the
I'm
arena
on
to
your
make
tail.
you think a pack of vandals got loose out there.
Orange on me.
We've got the Kingfish returning to the arena. And
I
just
strike
like
to
that, a
rob
cash
the
box
objective,
changes hands,
so-
and it's snagged by the ultra rares.
I'm straight out of here. We running shit up to A, twin.
Cash out in progress. The ultra rares are making it happen.
It's rocket time.
I am OMW. Pink's on you. Pink's dead. One Pink's dead.
That
Pink on
fucking
them.
sensor grenade has the longest range I've ever seen.
It's the proximity sensor for medium. It's really good. It's your tripod.
No, it's the grenade one because it's always moving. It like slides on the floor.
Behind you. Oh, that's our teammate. He's gonna die.
Mega damage has finished.
Orange is on me.
Satisfied after
Not no more.
Thank you.
But I don't want no smoke.
No, he doesn't. Because he'll fucking die.
On me, in the middle of the street.
Obstacle removed. Ultra doctor. Placing a cover.
This is so crazy.
Well, look at the angle I have.
That's wild.
It don't matter what you do with my
Bro.
objective.
Secures the win for
That shit was insane.
Was that a quick dub? Like we just straight won the game? Yeah, we did.
Yeah, again. Again.
That's 2 in a row. Just straight mop the floor.
Yeah, it's just like that when you're that good, you know?
Yo. Suffering from success. I need 3,800 more VR, and I will have unlocked everything in the game. Oh, sorry. Make it 4,600.
I've unlocked every gun, I just don't have every sight yet.
I don't have all the gadgets. I think I have all the sites I need, at least.
I have all the gadgets too.
I'm at the point of like, if I buy stuff, I'm probably not going to use it at this point, but also the most useful thing would probably be a site.
Alright, I'm gonna... I gotta go eat.
Okay.
I will be back.
Dude.
shortly, though.
Pop in another game.
Okay.
Alright. These have been really fun games. Like really fun games today. I actually cannot wait to get this VOD uploaded, especially now that I have like all my channels and stuff put together. Like I can straight upload my VOD to YouTube. I can go over to TikTok and Instagram and throw up a what is the word I'm looking for? A clip of a funny moment or something.
All right, the Vogues, the Overdogs, and finally, the Socialites.
Bum, bum, bum,
The heat is on. Let's see who shines.
This is going to be my last game of the day. We are rolling up on 12 o'clock noon EST, which is normally when I stop the stream for today on Saturdays.
It's all about who can keep their cool in this high-pressure situation.
I do plan to stream all later on today, but it's going to be more of like either a multi-game stream or something more casual. I kind of just probably want to gang be something fun, like something that's not competitive at all. But if we do choose to be competitive, it's because we want to, not because maybe it is.
That's the finals for you, folks.
I don't know if Gary left the Discord. It probably, yeah, that seems like he did.
Anything can happen.
There's no overlay for him anymore.
The first team wipe has happened. That's gotta hurt.
The Socialites have opened the round strong. First cash out started. A contestant is destroying stuff left and right. Look at them go.
Oh shit! Sorry, chat.
Defend cash out, eh? Here's some protection. Barricades up.
Impressive steal by the Overdogs. The
Holy,
Socialites will need to reboot. Team wiped.
Time to trade those party
so much happening.
Impressive steal by the Vogues.
Steal on A. Going in.
When I pulled it off, I didn't really mean for it to land on a roof
What a
like
way
that.
to open the match. The Vogues land the first cash out.
Barricades up. Reload, back in action. I'm reloading.
The Vogue swooped up a cash box.
Don't shield the blow. Over here. box 2.
Our orbital laser is on, and it's not a fan of motoring. All contestants standing still. Closely regretted.
Damn. And then I can do these 2 heavies, you know what I mean? Our health pool is just so big in that fight, it's just nothing you can do.
Reloading.
The vote swooped up a cash box. Another stage dive for the vote.
Dude, this guy don't care
Thanks,
nothing.
Team
Nothing.
wipe.
It seems they
Go
couldn't
after
find
cash
their
box
run
two.
rate
Don't know that.
success.
Hey, Monty. Hey, Monty.
Let's move to cash out station C. Taking damage. Don't seal the floor.
A spectacle.
The socialites got hold of the cash box.
Go, go. Move to cash out C. Affirmative.
The socialites kick things off with precision. Cash out initiated.
Explosive mindset.
The overdogs stumble again. Another team wipe.
They lost the sense of victory that
Barricading. Explosive mine out.
We got the overdogs returning to the arena.
time. They look enthusiastic. Those who want to stay clear of them or be ready to face the payback.
Explosive mine placed. Thanks. Reinforcing the area.
Steal attempt gone bust. Our contestants are letting their cash slip away.
Planting a mine. Go defensive on C. Deploying the support.
Halftime. The tension is rising by the minute.
one to the dogs for them, Scotty.
The Overdogs are re-engaging.
Time for a little revenge. The socialites better be
Vault 3,
prepared.
move!
The socialites are dazzling the crowd. They're opening Vault 3.
I promise you. We
Here's
don't
some
know that
cover.
deep.
Here's a barricade!
Bro, why are you on my dick?
Bring the cash out D!
Grab the cash box.
This orange team is so fucking pathetic, bro.
Yeah.
Like, why the fuck are we fighting so far from the objective and then my team just gets whopped up?
Cash out D, let's go! Enemy has a cash box!
A cash box. Ah, they just love that spotlight.
Go after cash box 3! Good catch!
Team respawn.
Um,
Wiped out again.
That's not how you should RSVP to a party, Scotty.
The Vogue swooped up a cash box.
Go, go! Move to cash out D!
The Vogues are setting the stage. Progress is over.
Enemy down!
bro, if you know your aim is bad, switch guns. Why is you trying to fight that? I don't know, bro. I don't know. Like I said, just last. I'm not even tripping off of it. I would like to win,
Steal cash
The
out D!
socialites have returned to the arena.
Time for some
but we've also had a
revenge.
good stream.
Overdogs
We've
better
had
be
a
ready
good
for a fight.
going.
A top dog steal from the Overdogs.
What? Why did my grapple not pull it?
Boy, the Vogues will strut their stuff on the sidelines for a bit. Another team wipe.
This dude.
Let's see
Make a decision, you indecisive cuck. Oh my god.
We've got a nail biter of a match with the score tied so far. It's a new chance for a new dance and for a new romance.
This dude's jumping off the map. My other teammate can't make a decision for
Vault 4
himself.
is being unlocked by the socialites.
It's just when does it end?
Explosive mine armed. Setting a mine.
The socialites
cash
swooped up
out
a
A.
cash box.
Aye. Move to cash out A.
Making it look easy, the socialites start a cash out.
Yeah. Place the proximity sensor. Deploying a surprise.
Oh, y'all.
They'll dig their way back.
Scotty, I bet there'll be some bowed heads and tucked tails on that team.
Why are y'all so far?
Back in play.
The Vogues better be prepared. After all, they organized that wipeout.
Hurry inside.
The clock is ticking and the teams need to step up.
I'm gonna jump here.
Here we are, down to the final 30 seconds.
This is the final sprint.
Raising a shield. Barricade deployed.
The socialites mixed polished strategy.
We still won that. I don't know how. We have clutched
Thanks for watching.
so many games this stream. I cannot count. So with that being said, this is going to be the last game of the stream. It was great having you. Thank you for coming out if you did, and I will see you in the next one.